Thanks so much, Chuck. I want to say a word on my timekeeping skills. I've never been good at time, and I'm showing that right now. But unfortunately, we have a precedent yesterday of catching up remarkably. I don't know how we did it, but I hope we do it again today. No pressure, but no, I will take a moment, despite saying that, to point out that the bios in our beautiful brochure are exceptionally modest. I should say this for both speakers, but especially Victor. I'm seeing here that we have not captured, or he has not captured, his extensive experience all over the world. I don't know if people are aware that this country and possibly the world went through a distancing from the discipline of planning in the middle of the 20th century. And sort of coincidentally, in the city of Miami, where I actually grew up, there's a cluster, an innovation cluster, where the discipline of planning has had its resurgence. And Victor Dover is very much at the center of that resurgence, and his remarkable career in creating places all over the country and the world is not captured in this bio. But we're very lucky to capture him here today, so thank you, Victor, for speaking with us. Take your time, sort of.
Thank you for having me. I've got my watch. You know, I'm very flattered to be part of this. I sat through yesterday with a sense that I was in the room with all of you at the same time when you may not appreciate it, but 10 years from now, I hope you'll look back and realize that you were here at a historic moment in the life of your community. It feels like you've all taken a pause, you've done your reassessment, you're ready to press the reset button on the implementation of the grand plans for the reuse of the base. And this is a fantastic moment to stop and reflect on what the things are you do in that implementation that will make the most difference. This big incomplete task with regard to what's called in the reuse plan design guidelines, and the ongoing task of reviewing individual increments of development for conformance with the big vision is so incredibly important. The quote from Mayor Riley was about basically how when we draw lines on a map, they reverberate through history. They echo for generations. As an urban designer, I'm in the best business in the world, actually. I have the best imaginable job. I'm in the before and after business. You know, like the advertisers who put the dirty T-shirt in one detergent or the other one, and they hold it up and they say, which is cleaner? Which would you prefer? Before and after, new and improved. That's what we do in designing pictures of places that don't exist yet. We have to stand there and stare at sometimes god-awful ugliness or incompleteness and scratch our heads and visualize what it could be instead. How you could take the thing you've already got and transform it into something you would rather have. Or how you can undertake the natural processes of growth and change and have the result of that be that growth and change made things better rather than worse. I'm going to stop on that just for a second. Imagine visualizing change before it occurs in a way that the change and growth made things better rather than worse. It sounds a little funny to Americans, particularly to Floridians or Californians who have spent their lives conditioned to be suspicious of growth and change because of all the built evidence, or so much of it anyway, in recent memory where growth and change made things worse rather than better. We're suspicious of that idea, but we have to rekindle our confidence in the idea that growth and change can make things better. We have to rekindle our self-confidence in putting one brick on top of another in a way that we can stand back proudly and say, you know, that was a good trade. That was a good exchange. That was an upgrade. There was a moment for me that probably the most important defining moment in my career was the one where I was needling the local planning director about implementation, picky little things like that, planning. And in frustration, he finally turned to me and he said, Victor, we can't plan yet. We're not sure what's going to happen. And I realized at that instant what it was really all about. It was about taking the time every once in a while to lift our eyes above the horizon and look off past today's decision, but off further about how it would all add up into something we would like. That's what it actually was. It wasn't about waiting to see what the change was and then trying to run around and remediate and mitigate for the disaster of it. It was instead about deciding what we wanted to be and working toward that goal. And that sounds really basic. But in base reuse projects, it is particularly hard to get people to remember that. They are, on one hand, big, ambitious, interdisciplinary, usually multiple local governments involved. They take a very long time. They have big budgets. They have lots of land. But their very bigness often makes it difficult for people to do that simple thing of saying, what will it all be? How nice could we make it? How could we make it add value over generations instead of going down in value after opening day? That's, I think, the essence of this connection between design and prosperity that you want to make in today's session. I worked on several base reuse projects. I worked on the South Weymouth Naval Air Station in Massachusetts, and the Brunswick Naval Air Station in Brunswick, Maine, which is a blimp base, fascinating thing, and on Fort Monroe, an Army base in Hampton, Virginia. I learned a lot about those things. There are a tremendous number of factors that affect success, and you've heard about a lot of them yesterday. The business plan and the physical plan, for example, and the interaction between those. And so I don't want to diminish any of those factors. They're all important. But I actually did come to conclude, after working on this for quite a while, that there was one factor that makes the most lasting difference, and that is the quality of streets. John Massingale, an architect in New York, and I embarked on what we thought would be a quick and easy project because we'd been thinking about streets for a long time. We wrote this book on street design. It 3.5 years later, the quick and easy project wasn't so quick and it wasn't so easy. We took 18,000 photographs and we traveled around revisiting places we thought we knew well, checking basic core principles we thought we fully understood, measuring things we thought we had memorized, and finding out we were wrong about a lot of it, fixing that, and boiling it down into the book. Pretty excited about it. It actually ships from the warehouse in 2 days. So a 3.5-year journey, finally hitting a kind of threshold point. So I am talking about streets today, and I have some of the pictures that I'll show you are actually from the book. And I put this out here partly as visuals to fuel your conversation about the quality of place. When I speak about street design, I'm not talking about the dimensions of the lanes between the curbs or just the radii of the curb returns at the intersections or just the lampposts and street trees and things. I'm actually talking about the whole thing, the architecture, the space making that Peter spoke about yesterday and Chuck spoke about again today, that public realm idea. Wholeness is one of the most important features and themes of the successful streets we found on our little journey. The hardest thing to remember when we sit down looking together over a great big map with markers or measuring tools or computers is that change over time is what we're really designing. We're designing something that even in big ambitious projects will unfold in pieces, in steps. A little bit will be done, and a little more will be done, and a little more will be done. And gradually the place that we used to know will be changed into something slightly different. And the question is, can we do that in such a way that as it grows denser and more complete, to use Vince Graham's thought, less isolated, and where people are doing more of what they've always naturally done in cities, which is coming together for their collective convenience and security, and because we're social beings, coming closer together. As these people come closer together, will we actually like it more instead of less? How can we upgrade it? So in planning, very often what we do is we lay out a big map on the table or on the computer screen, and we think of it like a static, two-dimensional thing. But in fact, it's more like a movie than a map. It's about change over time. You know, like in the animation where there's just a very slight difference between one frame and the next frame and the next frame. And taken in isolation, they seem like they're just stills, but put together in a sequence, action occurs, right? Planning is like this because of the slow way it unfolds. It's probably frustrating in 2013 to look back and to all of you, see very little change since 1991. In fact, a lot has been done. And it's a little bit like watching the glacier move from week to week, isn't it? You can't see it with the naked eye, but if you stand back or you go away for a while and you come back and look, actually a lot is changing. The question of that sense of a movie, sense of change over time, is will you plan the steps, scene by scene, to go from where you are to where you want to be? So I have two big ideas to lay on you in my presentation as we work to catch up. This is the first one. Think like a movie, not like a map, because you're designing change over time in a step-by-step sequence. Now, things will come out of order, and surprises will happen, and you'll change your agreement about the desired destination over time. After all, planning is a verb, not a noun. That's okay. But it will unfold step by step. Now, Savannah is the example that Chuck showed you in a historic etching. Remember that? And at the stage when they were just tearing the town out of the wilderness, they set the basic genius of the Savannah plan up. But what he didn't tell you was that when Savannah was first laid onto the land, and they were fighting with the snakes and the mosquitoes and the angry natives and so on, they were really building a single-family, large-lot, detached house subdivision. And what they did over time was fill in the blank spaces and replace the single-family cabins or detached houses with more permanent structures. And there were more of them, and they were taller, and they were closer together, and then they were further subdivided. So the Savannah that now shows up in movies or in postcards, or people go there to see the culture of the place, is actually about 10 times as dense as the Savannah that was first settled using that historic map. It actually grew more complete and got better as it grew denser and older, which is kind of nice. So that's this change over time theme. How can we do that? Well, the second big idea that I want to lay on you that's important is the way we do that is by making addresses. Not by making parcels, not by establishing and meeting levels of service, not by the numbers. The way we really do it is by setting a place up as somewhere where people want to be because it's cool to be there, that it draws you to that place. And that's the address you want, whether it's for your home or your business or your institution or what have you. And over time, you will recycle it. You know, if the address is so good that you'll take the building that no longer serves your purposes down and replace it with one that is a more permanent structure, usually bigger and taller and more lasting. You will recycle the historic buildings in such a place because the address is what matters, and it's unthinkable to just pick up and go somewhere else. The pod-by-pod mentality that dominated 20th century, second half of the 20th century in real estate that Chuck described, thank God that millennium's done. We don't have to do that mistake anymore. But that mentality was one that did not lend itself to recycling. It was build the place once in whole cloth, lock it down tight with as many regulations and codes, covenants, and restrictions, and property owners associations and so on. Rig the system as much as possible to minimize change once that's done, and hopefully by giving all that certainty, guarantee the results. That's not a street and recycling approach. So when we look at historic cities, we see something quite a bit different. What we see is the very reason why people are drawn back to them year after year, and why the younger generation doesn't want anything to do with those suburban pods. There was a op-ed piece published in the national newspapers a few weeks ago addressed from the millennials to the baby boomers. Dear Mom and Dad, we're not going to buy your house. Very interesting. That should strike fear in most of us. Well, the reason is because to them, cities are cool, and what makes the cities cool are great street spaces. So they're sort of fearlessly returning to the streets. Well, so are Mom and Dad. So the economic implications of getting that right are huge because you have not just the 78 million millennials, but the 82 million baby boomers along with them who in droves are going where the action is, where the caffeine is, where the art and culture is, where your friends are. So we have to look hard at these streets. This is College Town. This is Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor exists on that delicate little axis that starts in Chapel Hill and then runs through Fayetteville, Arkansas, and up through Ann Arbor and down through Boulder and over to Berkeley. It's very special places. Well, very often in these towns we can see on exhibit what it is that makes a great street. In fact, Ann Arbor is so good at it, they have two main streets. A street as a public space. Now, the typical commercial arterial corridor in the sprawl model doesn't lend itself to this recycling process at all. In fact, no placemaking occurs, no great address is established. Mostly, it just feels like used real estate. So people skip over it and go on to the next piece of raw land farther out. An incredibly destructive process, both economically and environmentally. So it's worth looking. This is a great book Julie Campoli and Alex McLean and others worked on with aerial views, comparing places. It's worth looking at the difference in the way we used to leverage infrastructure investments and the way they were done in the 1970s model in the latter part of the 20th century. On the left is Church Street. You can tell by that steeple at the end of it. And here's a picture of what happened when government made an advance investment proactively in a couple thousand feet of infrastructure. What they got was the address everybody wanted, and so if you look closely at that picture, that's where you shop, that's where a lot of people live, that's where a lot of people go to work. It's also where the institutions are, and it's lined up on the Church Street so they could send this kind of visual message about the importance of that institution. It's also where you park. It's where you hold the 4th of July parade. It's where you hold the holiday tree lighting ceremony. It's where you meet a friend for lunch, and on and on and on. The one on the right is a couple thousand feet of very expensive gold-plated infrastructure, all done according to 20th century regulations, in which instead of that great address, we have buildings poking out of parking lots. Surrounded by a perfunctory, regulation-compliant quantity of open space and a state-of-the-art stormwater management system for each parcel and each user on each lot. So basically, treated like asteroids in which each user is assumed to be floating by themselves in space. In fact, they're not, because the very design means that in Williston here, you can get in your car and go out on the same road that everyone else is using at exactly the same time to do anything like get lunch or get a haircut or get to and from home. Whereas in the Church Street model on the left, when people make any one of those trips, they add to the quality and success of the scene instead of just adding to the quantity and the disease of the traffic congestion. So in the book, we look a lot at new streets and some of the breakthroughs that have occurred, like in Glenwood Park, on making new streets, even when you had to drag the transpocracy and local government through that, kicking and screaming, are pretty instructive. Sometimes we're now in new neighborhoods, we're getting things like astonishingly skinny streets. We were just not getting permission to build 20 years ago. This is Swift Street, which is a residential street in BV, Colorado. They don't, in Miami we would say Buena Vista. They say Buena Vista in that place. It's called Swift Street not because it's a fast street, but because the engineer was Peter Swift. We named the slowest, skinniest street in the county after him, and it's called Swift Street. But the idea is we're now getting to permission when we're doing a street from scratch for small is beautiful. I think far more interesting, actually, is the subject of retrofitting streets we've already got. Certainly we see that in Marina. I took this morning a tour with Peter, and we looked at DeForest and Del Monte and Reservation and street after street, actually, that were built in that 20th century model that as you're resetting up your town for a new millennium will just lend themselves to retrofits over time, particularly recovering the amount of space devoted to auto-moving asphalt and putting more of it to work for pedestrians, cyclists, and transit users. We've seen some of this actually happen pretty inexpensively and modestly on small amounts of land. In South Miami, which is my town, we did a plan in the early 90s, this is the transit station, the top of that picture, at US Highway 1. And the Dorn Avenue was just basically an alley. It was a back-of-house space, 1 block long here, mostly asphalt, the world's widest street for some reason, not quite sure why. That was retrofit to skinny it down and make really wide sidewalks. We repealed the ordinance prohibiting outdoor dining. Yes, they had an ordinance prohibiting outdoor dining in South Florida, which is hard to understand. But we did that. And it overnight changed from being a dead space to being the social center of the community. And it was done without a lot of new buildings. Eventually we got new buildings there, mostly just popping doors, storefronts and windows into the blank walls of the buildings that were there before. And so that kind of retrofit is very modest, and it seems to me you don't need to think in terms of overcoming every problem on every site. Eventually we started getting the first new Main Street buildings in 70 years on that place. This has emboldened the new urbanists to think about harder problems like the bigger trafficked corridors. Still in town, this is Columbia Pike in Arlington, Virginia, before and after, done in 2002, when their idea of mixed-use multi-story buildings instead of the one-story buildings set back behind parking lots all seemed like a pipe dream. They changed the rules, and in fact, it's begun to happen. They have quite a few projects. They are getting millions and millions of dollars annually in property tax revenues they were not getting before. They allowed those changes to the rules and unleashed the power of private development to do street-oriented architecture. We've since, I think, gotten bolder about transit-oriented development in those locations at the bright center of the metropolis and its new centers. This is in downtown Kendall, and while we cringe at some of the architectural quality, and we use pictures like this one to go back to our students in architecture school and say, now, we have to get buildings that are as good as these city plans. We are nevertheless really happy about the return of people to walking distance around transit stops, even in historically unwalkable Southeast Florida. So what about the Strip? What about the places where a wide road is inevitable, where you have to do it and that's just a given? Is there a way you could make wide streets that are still great streets? And the answer, of course, is yes. This is one example of that, where what was a wide street and the drive aisles in the private parking lots is changed into a multi-lane boulevard where the through-going streets are between those tree lines are relatively unimpeded. And the local street here in a European-style slow lane or side access lane is the one where the on-street parking can be, where you can have a lot of intersections, where storefronts can face it, and you actually can extend the public realm to include part of the space where vehicles are moving. That's a before and after. And I put it here to remind me to press on you the importance of visuals and a compelling idea in your plan, because this image got them $70 million of funding under a Tiger grant, much like the one you recently got here, the same kind of program. They used this to move to the front of the line, and I think that's that value of planning when it comes to getting the money to implement. Certainly you have a lot of recent local experience with that idea. Well, here's an even harder one. What do you do when you had a mall and then it died? Notice the mall parking lot. I love this photograph. There's just no one parking there on that particular asteroid with Battlestar Galactica parked on it. Well, part of it means doing what business people have been doing for a long time now. This little cartoon, which compares the poor hapless sucker on the right here to this happy biking Brit with his basket of baguettes over there, suggests that the business community has already begun to figure this out. They know that the livable community thing or the creative class attraction is how they're going to win in the next round of real estate. I've redacted the particular marts and RSs in this picture. Just to want to point out, this cartoon was not published in the Village Voice or Creative Loafing or some radical left-wing rag. This was published in the Wall Street Journal. Okay? So in places where we have these big scabs on the landscape, I believe what's going to happen is that we will see gradual transformation to incremental scale development. We'll see streets return, and then building by building, the addresses filled up along those streets. Instead of a parking lot and a building sitting in the center of it, you're going to have street networks, and then you're going to gradually fill in the lots along those streets. That's a leaner model, a cleaner model, but it also is the one that builds community character people are actually interested in. So then the question becomes, how small can we go? How little can the phases of implementation, as we retrofit this auto space into a multimodal space, how small can it be? You know, how much does it really take to actually arrest the senses, reset planning and expectations, and get people to think of these as great addresses again instead of just parking sites? So I'll show you this little site in Schodack in upstate New York. This is the intersection, and I'm not kidding, of Columbia Turnpike and Unnamed Street. Don't you love it? This is just really a curb cut into a parking lot. And the little diagram you saw a moment ago is about what you could do in the corner. And the first thing is just basically an out parcel, the same way that they plug a branch bank or a Wendy's or a muffler shop into one of those outlying parcels. But it's one that's arranged with doors and storefronts facing public space, and it's set forward, not set back, and it's not got the car space swirling around it. And then that's how much you could make. So a little computer model just to illustrate that there's not very much construction here, but there's a ton of visual reset, because now this is in your field of vision, right, as you go by on this street. And from that, you can add. Once you reestablish a place with a small amount of development, you want to do the wholeness of the space I talked about with the first slide. So you start building both sides of the street and facing fronts with other fronts to continue on what we've done. And then nothing succeeds like success. If you find market acceptance for that, it can go on and on at the market's own pace. And each phase looks pretty nice and works by itself, but as you add to it, it will work better. Eventually, in these scenarios for change over time, some of the older wafer slab kind of or pole barn buildings get replaced. So we have to give lessons because, you know, as mid-career professionals, we must panel. So here's my panel lesson. 5 simple things we try to do well when we're using a street-oriented approach to retrofit. The first one is that the street that we like almost always has a definable spatial enclosure. It has a shape, like a room that Chuck described, and that's formed by the walls on the side, that is the buildings, and the architecture, and the trees, and its proportion of the height of those to the width between them. So the height to width ratios, when you see urban designers run around like this, they're not filmmakers from California framing up their next shot or University of Miami fans saying it's all about the U. They are looking at the proportion of height to width in public space. Well, when the height to width ratio gets too wide, the sense of space diminishes and the value drops also. So you can see that everywhere you go. From now on, when you go to a main street or a positive public space that you like, hold up your hands and look at the height to width ratio on exhibit in that place. It'll make you a good citizen planner. The second one is that the streets we love to be on are comfortable because they're climate adapted. And it varies from place to place. You know, a place where you can grow big street trees, that's one way to do it. In a place where you're combating glare on storefronts, as I know you are here, and they are also in Barcelona. They're on the Ramblas. They use the awnings and marquees and canopies against that. But the comfort making on the street comes with the way the architecture and the landscape are arranged. Third, and this one's complicated, so I'll just graze on it, but it has to do with being connected. The streets we want to be on are the ones that are part of an integrated network of streets. Walkable streets. That doesn't mean, by the way, you can't drive on them or move a minivan on them or collect the garbage on them. Walkable just means we start with the pedestrian and then we work on the design to accommodate those other needs. It's the opposite of starting with the truck traffic or the throughput for cars at peak hour and then at the end trying to add on things to make pedestrians and cyclists happy. Okay? So now when it's connected, some pretty powerful things happen. For one, the intersections multiply when you have something that's more like a web and less like a tree. So here's a pretty poor plan in which all of the traffic converges on just a few points at the peak hour when everybody's trying to go from from one place to another. So these days we add up intersections per square mile as a kind of indicator of a better plan or worse. Chuck and Peter both showed you slides of new towns. One of the ones Chuck showed is Celebration. Here they have about 10 times as many intersections per square mile as you saw in the previous Texas example, which I'm sure is making the Texans crazy because they like to be biggest at everything. And the answer, of course, is that they have a long way to go, because in Rome they have 1,000 intersections per square mile. And when you're actually rich with intersections and you have a web, not a tree, for a street plan, the streets don't have to be too big, because the secret to traffic congestion isn't more lanes and faster speeds. The secret to solving traffic congestion is network, where you spread the demand out among multiple parallel routes. There are lots of benefits to that way of thinking. I'll just put up one, because I know you're trying to meet your Air Resources Board rules. Your carbon footprint will drop dramatically, according to the scientists, when you have more links and nodes in a tighter web. So we'll have happier pedestrians too, but you'll also drop your CO2 impact. The next of the 5 big things is that it has to be safe. Of course, you don't want to fear getting run over. Speed is everything with regard to this. Road designers, whether they're engineers or urban designers, transportation planners, they speak in terms of something called design speed or target speed. This has nothing to do with what the signs say about the posted legal limit. This is about how they put things together, like the width of the lanes, the angle of the cross slopes, the distance to the nearest trees, the radius of the curvatures, and so on, to accommodate a higher speed with safety. The problem is, when the design speed is high and people speed up, then when there is a collision that involves a motorist and a pedestrian, that little bit of increase in speed makes a tremendous difference in the mayhem that results. Just go from 20-mile-an-hour crash to a 30-mile-an-hour crash, and we have 10 times as many fatalities in that situation. And so safety is kind of obvious in its connection to comfort. As we design for higher and higher speeds, we are pushing pedestrian comfort to the side and to the margins. This is pretty crucial, because we want people to go outside, even with that ugly sweater, and be in that public space and drive that economic activity and create those jobs, and they won't be happy doing it unless they're safe. Safety does mean thinking in terms of every user, not just the motorists. I like this picture. Can you spot the mammal in this photograph? The middle-aged man in Lycra mammal, staying just behind the girl cycling to the right of. They're all happy in the situation, and partly it's because they have space devoted to them, and partly because of the way the arrangement of things, like the aligned trees, the subtle palette of materials and geometries, gives them that sense of safety when they're there. The Europeans are phenomenally ahead of us on this. Think of that cyclist you saw in the ugly sweater. In Stockholm, he would be presented with this option for how to go from A to B during his daily commute. Do we have anything like that to compare? It isn't actually so complicated. Design-wise, Robert Stern's first rule of design, line things up. They just planted the trees in a row. It's not that complicated. Now, obviously I'm touching on something that has come to have one of the best bumper stickers in the history of planning. Complete Streets. Isn't that a great bumper sticker of a name? This is a Complete Streets project in Fort Lauderdale. What do you think? They narrowed it up a little bit, and they repainted the street to create green bike lanes on the side. What do you say? Complete? Which one of these feels more like the complete street to you? Okay, so now the Complete Streets subject actually means we have to get better at this. We've had a kind of revolutionary change in transportation planning over the last 10 years or so. Thank God for the Complete Streets movement. But I do think it's time to be arguing for even completer streets in the next generation, including ones where we acknowledge a simple basic fact. If it's not yet beautiful, it's not complete. Okay? Here's Long Beach, California, Mecca for cyclists, where the left turn car crosses the cycling lane, which diverts briefly to the right as it approaches the intersection so that everybody... What? This is straight out of the Urban Bikeway Design Guideline instructions. Not so complete. So there's a whole thing going on right now in the background while you're working on Fort Ord, which is that transportation planning and traffic engineering are all being reinvented. Our assumptions about street design have all been changing, and it's pretty exciting. We used to think this was the model. That's from the DOT manual in Wisconsin, in which mobility and access are in this war, and you have to decide which one is going to win, and it's either a local street or a collector street or an arterial street. It's either rural, by which they mean suburban in their manuals, or it's urbanized, by which they mean suburban in their manuals. And where's the compact urban walkable option? Well, there's a real movement underway to improve those standards manuals. There's a lot of new literature and science that wasn't there 20 years ago. You can even go on change.org and search under my name or USDOT and sign a petition saying you want the guys at the top to acknowledge and endorse walkability with changes in the standards. So safe just basically means we also have to have people places. They have eyes on the street. They have front porches facing the street. If you were to get in trouble there, you call for help. You get the sense that someone would hear you or see you. Jane Jacobs wrote a lot about that idea. It's also the place that just sends a message because of the natural surveillance that if you're a bad guy or a bad gal, this is not the place to do your criminality. And the last of these, while I'll spend less time on it, is actually probably the most important. We are a very fickle and demanding species that wants its habitat to be just right for us to come back there again and again and spend our money, which means it has to be beautiful and interesting and memorable. Here's a college town. And it wasn't just about laying down streets for the free flow of vehicles from A to B. It was about creating a place where people would come into contact with one another and ideas would flow. And it wasn't just about the engineering, but also about the artfulness of that space. So the street here, for example, curves at just the right gentleness and sets up that site at the end for the beautiful deflected vista of one of the college buildings. Oxford has a great series of lessons for us about the integration of the college and the town. You find things when you are willing to look at history that you will be surprised are there. For example, this is the most beautiful parking lot in the world. People know it as the Avenue Diana. It's this great linear, beautiful park like boulevard that extends to the Arc de Triomphe. It also has more than 300 parking spaces on street per block. You just don't think you're in a parking lot when you're in that place with those beautiful London plane trees or the monumentality or even the urban and urbane architecture on the sides. So the most beautiful parking lot in the world isn't even a parking lot. It's actually a street. And history teaches you you can make those kinds of things with streets. Now I promised, just for the final seconds here, I promised Victoria I'd show you some examples of this change over time, streets are cool approach being used in retrofitting places that are already partly built. El Paso has really done this. That's a very car-oriented place. They have made a fundamental policy shift toward transit, especially 7 new bus rapid transit lines. And so they are thinking in terms of change over time. They are remaking, this is the policy plans for the town, like Plan El Paso, are built on the assumption they're going to go from parking lots to places. If that sounds so far-fetched, just take a look at headlines like that one. It's not Target, but it's Walmart. You can make mixed-use, multi-story buildings, and that's the most economically viable alternative for developers in those locales where the government will not have it any other way. The Dead Mall in El Paso is being recast right now under a street model. That's the new Main Street that replaces the Dead Mall in El Paso's current work. And the changes at first are pretty small. When we think about retrofitting suburbia, it's a step-by-step approach. You can imagine, for example, reintroducing streets, shortening the blocks, changing the building-to-street relationships, and over time, coming to something that's more like a place. I believe if we do that, we can make great places in the 21st century that are as good as any that were created by our forebears. Thank you very much.
That sounds like a really fun trip you took, Victor. I would like to go to all those places. Yeah, that's right. So before, it looks like I've got all the cards. Oh, wait, there's some more. There's a lot of questions. Wow. So I'm going to try to group some of them a little bit thematically. This is wonderful, all these questions. First of all, really quickly, what's the website address of the campus, Chuck, comparison? Would you just say it out loud because we couldn't read it?
It's the firm is Ayers, A-Y-E-R-S, St. Gross. It's an architecture firm. I don't have the website at my fingertips, but if you search for Ayers St. Gross and campus plans, I'm sure you would find it. And or ASG. And the slides, all of these presentations will be archived and made available to people, so you'll be able to see it on the slide.
There are at least 2 questions here about the issue of diversity that was raised and how that gets integrated into the process of this planning. Oh boy, this is the very part.
I feel a tweet chat coming on.
Yeah, seriously. I do want to say, just through my understanding of this 2 days, that the next panel will deal with a little bit more of that process. And obviously, these gentlemen have pointed out how important it is. And I just want to maybe suspend that question for the next panel, and therefore buy myself some more time. There's a question related that maybe this panel could pick up, though, on diversity of environment. So the idea of this community has gone through a lot when it comes to the protection of the natural fauna, the flora and the fauna. And I guess there's some concern, maybe even with what you've shown, how that gets taken into account. Obviously, we have set aside land that will remain untouched, but how does even the planning take that into account? And actually, we have a 3rd panel today that will address that too, but maybe you guys could say a short word on that.
I think in my presentation, I was definitely highlighting the fact that, especially as a first-time visitor in this part of the state, you have a fantastic natural environment. So in terms of the need to protect and embrace that, not only as something off by itself, that's a nice natural environment to look at and to visit and to have some recreation and other opportunities, but integrated right into the development. So there's no reason why the natural flora and fauna that's here should not be present in the places that you're building. And we've got, like right out front, there's a couple of nice trees, a couple of nice specimens out front. I don't think the bark chips are, indigenous, but there's a lot you can do and avoid, the tendency to just create the grassy knolls and the endless unsustainable types of habitat. It's part of your identity and really should be celebrated, and it's worthwhile to have a genuine, real master of landscape architecture who understands it, working with you to integrate it into campus plans and development plans.
One of the great things about this session is that later this afternoon you get to hear from Doug FORA, who's sitting right over there, who wrote the book, literally, on sustainable urbanism. Well, he wrote most of it. The chapter on neighborhood design is awesome, too, I'll say. But now Doug will talk about wildlife and energy and air quality and water quality and so on. So I want to just address one aspect of this diversity. The human habitat also requires an ecosystem mentality in which we're accepting species richness. The humans are actually quite diverse as well. We have households of all different sizes, as Chuck pointed out. Well, the Ozzie and Harriet Leave It to Beaver model assumed all the households were virtually the same, and they were all suited for nesting and roosting and nurturing their young in single-family detached houses and then driving all the time. That model isn't the only kind of household we have anymore. In fact, it's by far the minority in the type of households that are being newly created, even in your region. So therefore, some of the interest in adding back all of the rest of the missing types of development in terms of price and size and characteristics is built in, I think, to the new planning. So when you see in the images that we've been showing, things like mixed-use Main Street environments coming back after a 50 or 60-year hiatus, well, that's creating another kind of roost upstairs for offices or apartments that might be there. If you see things like attached houses where detached houses were by far the norm, well, that's creating another kind of nest. So I tend to think that our institutions and businesses follow something similar. We have small ones and large ones. We have the ones that need a lot of privacy and need security and need to be in their own compound enclave. And we have the ones that actually need to be where the action is and where people come into contact with their fellow executives or fellow researchers or what have you. By far, we have more of the latter type. But the office park model and the research park model, and in fact many college campus models, are focused only on one of those. So you go through the same thing with the institutions. We are diverse and we need more than one solution, therefore more than one kind of place. They do all have in common streets. I don't want you to get the impression that you have to throw that idea away, because that idea actually adapts and scales to the whole range.
I have a quick street question follow-up that might be a quick one. So, by the way, I have over 25 questions here, so we're not going to get to all of them. I'm going to try to clump them, cluster them, if you will. The one-way street, someone just asked, do you ever have one? Is one-way streets ever a good idea?
Great question.
Quick one.
Okay, one-way streets, especially the pairs that were foisted upon struggling downtowns starting in the 1950s, for a while were just reviled by the urbanists, and we point out, for example, the economic decline that often followed when Main Street was turned from a two-way coming and going to just a part of a pair, because it's harder to run a storefront business on a one-way street. And so we pick on one-way streets a lot. When they are over-implemented as an idea, they can be disastrous. They actually exacerbate the number of miles traveled as you circulate looking for your destination or for a parking space. And so that even has tailpipe emission implications and energy waste implications and time implications. All right, so we pick on one-way streets, and we've been doing that for 25 years. But this is really important. One of the things that became very clear to me as we traveled to research the book was that we've been a little too simplistic about that. There are situations, especially the ones in which you have a rich pattern of streets with lots of streets, where you can take some of them and make them special streets, like really skinny streets or pedestrian-only streets, or yes, even one-way streets. And so having a lot of streets to work with means you can make some wide and some skinny. It means you can make some one-way even, and the world won't come to an end. But one-way streets and pedestrian streets and super skinny streets and super wide streets are all medicines that should be administered in small doses at intervals that are appropriate for the patient, not taken as the single solution.
So, by the way, I just want to remind folks that we have this device called Lunch with an Expert, which we will, I think, very much be taking advantage of to follow up on some of these questions that we will not get to. There's a number of questions here about why we're stalled and what lessons there are for going forward. Is this a cost issue? Is this costing too much? It occurs, doing it right, it occurs to me that it's possible that maybe we haven't attracted the right developers because we haven't, you said there's a $70 million image you showed, that sometimes the right image gets the right investment. So maybe we haven't framed it right in order to attract. So there's an implementation thing. And then here's a question that frames it nicely. It says, Victor talked about thinking of planning like a movie. For a place like Fort, what would be the next 2 to 3 scenes? So an idea of how to overcome the possible obstacles in just implementation, attracting development, et cetera. What are the next 2 to 3 scenes?
I know you're going to have something to say about this. I'll try and go quick. First of all, when government is involved in a really big way with big investments, which was inevitable here, it tends to have a distorting effect on the natural progress of things. If you were working with the minimum means and you had to build your way out of the problems and into success as you went instead of making the big moves, which followed this process, then you would do what John Smith does, Captain John Smith, when he lands on the Virginia coast and has to start Jamestown. You would clear a path into the land. That's a street, by the way, because you want to get from the edge, from the coast, into the land, the minimum amount of work. And as you did that, you'd start setting up addresses on both sides of that new street. Okay, the first thing you might do is build a little stockade out of some trees you felled, so you had some place to sleep safely. But then after that, the next thing you would do is build a street into the land. And you would do it with minimum means. So phase one has to actually generate economic success that provides the working capital for phase two. This isn't the approach that has typically been used in base reuse projects, because there are huge big ticket items: brownfield remediation, taking out buildings that need to be demolished, all of the whole conversion of the place. And so I think that distortion just kind of, you start with that. So now I think the question is, what minimum moves could you make where people would start to see it? If the project that on the Panhandle of Florida that really didn't just change development there and make a ton of money, it actually changed city planning. It was only 80 acres big. It was 80 acres, and it just reset everybody's minds. Because the first few moves, the first street was so nice that it made the cover of all the national magazines, and it became a story. So you have to have something at which, however small, you are the best of kind, so that people will make their way to your place and see it. They can see a postcard picture in that first small phase of what you're trying to be when it all grows up. And that's, I think, part of the frustration with the shopping center, because I will tell you, I've been around the country and I've seen a lot of uglier shopping centers. That one's actually pretty fancy. The landscaping is more elaborate. It has a more advanced and articulated form of SketchUp modern architecture.
He's talking about REI.
I am talking about REI and Target. There are a lot of uglier ones. But what's not happening with that development by itself is you can't stand there and say, we're making a unique best of kind place that has a story of its own to tell, which is its own kind of address. Instead, it's a little more like generic retailing USA. So that's not too bad. That gets cash registers ringing and produces some sales tax revenue and gets a start. But I would urge you in the next couple of scenes in this multi-frame animation to build something that's street space making. Now, the downtown marina is one of those places where I know they're working on that. And great promise lies in that.
That's wonderful. So this is kind of you can never have a second chance to make a first impression idea. Come out of the gate.
Everything
strong.
Bad that's happened, whether it's recent or in the distant past, is just the makings of a dramatic before and after picture.
That's right. Wonderful. That's nice reframing.
Let's keep going.
Keep going. You know what? I would like to actually end it there. We are. I would love to. I know that you guys will be popular at your tables. Like I said, a number of these questions are thematic, and some of them have to do with work-live and the contrast you guys pointed out with folks on tech versus places. Like, don't those seem kind of counterintuitive? Why don't I just stay home all the time? You could argue, of course, that the more you don't have. I love this phrase you had. We want places where you don't have to go, where you want to go. So as we become freed from place, in a way, it becomes even more important for places to be desirable. So anyway, I am so thrilled with this panel and thrilled with what we're about to hear. And I don't want to get in the way of that any further, but thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today.
I'm informed by my colleagues